Hello, youth leaders, youth workers, and youth pastors. I'm James Saban.
Hey, and I'm Todd Parridge, and you're listening to the Youth Ministry Soul Keeper podcast. This is a podcast with a little bit of humor, a little bit of coaching, and a whole lot of care.
That's right, and we're so honored to be part of the Download Youth Ministry Network.
So good. Hey, and welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Youth Ministry Soul Keeper podcast. Today, we have not necessarily a super fun topic, but I think a good topic. We're going to be talking about some volunteers, and maybe not the best volunteers. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. If you've been in ministry for more than 10 minutes, you know that volunteers are the lifeblood of what we do. You know, they're the heroes that show up week after week, love students, they lead small groups, they drive vans, they stay up late on trips. They make ministry possible, and they do it for free. And we know that without youth ministry volunteers, it's just not going to happen. But before we do that, before we jump in, James, tell us what worked this week at youth group.
Yeah, what worked was not having a Todd Parridge game. That's what worked.
It's just so hurtful.
Sorry, Todd. Sorry. You guys know that's not true. If you've been listening to this podcast, it's a total bit. We play a lot of Todd Parridge games. You know, it's just kind of one way that we support the Todd Parridge Fund. I mean, that's the one way. But no, they're just great. Todd is a prolific game author, and his games are great. And so we play a lot of Todd Parridge games. But really, so many games on Download Youth Ministry are just great. So we just kind of figured we'd add I really feel like a helpful segment to youth pastors on kind of, the games that we've been able to try and that have worked, and that have been great. And if they haven't worked, you just really won't hear about them. We're not really going to put down a game, like we're not going to do that here. But anyway, but the one that is Friday, yeah. And so the one we just played was Baby New Year. It's the new one that just came out. And what it is it's AI generated. A lot of course, AI generated games now coming out, and they're great. And it's AI generated babies of like some of our most, famous pop culture people. So you got in there just, people like Ed Sheeran, Miley Cyrus, Justin Bieber, the Beeb, Tom Holland, Olivia Rodrigo.
I don't know any of those people.
What's that?
I don't know any of those people.
That's right. No, I didn't know a lot of them. I didn't know. Well, that's not true. I didn't know Ja. I want to say, I'm trying to find him now. Where is he? He was in there. Oh, there he is. Yeah, I didn't know Ja Morant. So I don't know who that is. Sabrina Carpenter, she's in there. Ice Spice is in there. If I didn't say Post Malone already, Post Malone is in there. But anyway, it's really good. And I'll be honest, I played this at youth group, and our youth group loved it. We just did a classic four corners. They go to, the corner where they believe the birth year of that, of that character, that AI generated character is, and there could be more than one. I actually played this. Some of you might know. I'm also a part of WV, West Virginia University's FCA. I'm one of the chaplains for West Virginia University's FCA chapter, and I'm the games guy, right? So we played Download Youth Ministry games at FCA. They love them. In fact, we played this one, and they went crazy for it. The college kids went just as crazy, if not a little more, because this is totally in their wheelhouse, right? These are their people. Yeah. And they were all born around the same, you know what I mean? Like this was them. And so they had a blast playing this game. So anyway, just know it works in FCA, all the things, but it was a great game. So we had a lot of fun. And
I got to figure out how to sneak in a hail to pit graphic somewhere into a game while you're playing that.
That'll, what that'll get met with. I send you videos all the time. But
yeah.
Something about country. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a John Denver. No, it's a whatchamacallit song, Neil Diamond song, I think. But anyway, yeah, we won't say that. I'm always moving forward. Yeah, another thing that worked is I've been, sometimes, as youth leaders, we're trying to figure out, how do we train our leaders, and what's kind of the best rhythm, right, for training? Is it quarterly? Is it annually? A big annual meeting? Biannually? Some people do it weekly, and we've adopted kind of a both and. We started to do a big kind of front end meeting, and then a weekly meeting, 15 to 20, really about, it lives at 20 minutes. And and leaders have started to honor this time. They started to love it. We did it all last fall. It was a huge hit. I asked them how'd it go. I asked for feedback. They've loved it. They said they've retained more because you learn, and then you get to practice, right? It's right there. So we've been doing this on the front end, and then we kind of have one near the back end as well, a big one. That would be a big one. But it's been going great. Like I said, the feedback from my leaders, because I want to meet them where they're at and do what's really effective, and they've loved it. We actually add in there, I'm not just a talking head, Todd. But I'm asking questions. There's like there's input from them. They kind of have a little bit of group stuff too. So it's been really good and really positive.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, honestly, that you know, if they're in, it does make our job so much easier and more fun. I've always thought and have found it to be just really fun when you're rowing in the same direction and you kind of are all on the same page. And so I love that. I love the different kind of meetings that you're doing to build that community and get everybody all lined up. That's awesome.
That's right. And so speaking about volunteers, we're actually talking about today's podcast episode, how to identify toxic volunteers. Like how do we spot or see the red flags? For toxic volunteers, just kind of saying it like it is, kind of maybe before they do some damage to our ministry, right, Todd? So here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody kind of really prepares you for in seminary or ministry training. And sometimes the people who want to serve end up causing more harm than they do good. Sometimes a volunteer, for whatever reason, becomes toxic, damaging students, dividing teams, undermining the ministry that, we've worked so hard to make sure, that there's cohesiveness, that we're kind of all, like you said, rowing in the same direction. And I want you to know there's really, as Todd and I were going over this, there's so much in this that you can talk about, from identification to kind of like, okay, now what do we do after we've identified? And then like, well, what do healthy volunteers look like, right? This is really turning into a 3-part series. And so today in part 1, we're going to focus on identification, like what toxic volunteer behavior actually looks like, how to distinguish it from normal struggles, and why recognizing these patterns early is so important. And then in part 2, we'll tackle the hard part, right? Which is how to address it. And then when do we let someone go? Like, that's tough. Nobody wants to talk about like letting go volunteers. Like, how do you fire a volunteer, right? like how do you do that, Todd, right? That's always hard. I know, and it's been tough for you, and I know you could probably, share some stories. But, I want to be clear from the start. This isn't about being harsh, judgmental, or unloving, right? It's about protecting students. It's about protecting ministry health. And stewarding the leadership that God's given us well. And really, if we're honest, sometimes the most loving thing we can do is recognize when someone shouldn't be in a leadership position anymore, really for their sake, for the student's sake, and the ministry's sake, really.
Yeah. I think I'm going to love and hate this podcast. Because when it's done right, I love it. I mean, some of the volunteers over the years are still to this day my closest friends because you're in the trenches with them.
Yeah.
But when a toxic leader is part of that group, it can become one of the most difficult things to lead. And so, I think this is going to open up some memories and some things that I'm going to definitely want to celebrate, and other that I'm going to regret. But I think it's one of those conversations we need to have. And I think those of you who are listening, most likely you can identify that sentiment right away, that there are people that you go, man, I've good leaders, not great leaders, or you've experienced that. And so we just want to have the conversation, and we hope that it will help. But before we identify toxic behaviors, we want to kind of just an important distinction. And I would say that there's a massive difference between a volunteer who's struggling and a volunteer who's toxic.
Big time. Yeah. In fact, that's really true. And that's really important to distinguish that, right? Because a struggling volunteer is someone who they're just probably going through a hard season personally, right? This isn't their MO. This isn't who they always are. This isn't what you always get, right? This is something like they're different. Like something's going on now. They're not their usual self. Maybe it's a marriage crisis. Maybe it's a health issue, right? Financial stress or grief. And so maybe it's because they're making mistakes because what? They're new and they're still learning. Or maybe it's just an off week or an off month. If it's an off year, it's probably something more at play, right? But we're going to have all these things happen, yeah. But, here's the thing, though, that is a little different. Instead of responding negatively when we give feedback, they respond positively to feedback and coaching. They actually show genuine care. They're not indifferent, they're not detached, and even when they're not executing perfectly, their heart's in it, and they're humble and they're teachable. And so really these volunteers, they need grace, they need support, and they need patience. They need a youth pastor who will walk them through this difficulty, who will actually offer encouragement. And really, we just need to be the person who creates space for what? For growth. Because Yeah, ministry's messy.
Yeah.
And we're all a work in progress, right? We all need grace. Really, if we held everyone to a standard of perfection, I don't know about you, Todd, but none of us, I couldn't qualify
Yep.
to
I'd be
serve.
out.
That's for sure. Yep.
Yeah. So a toxic leader, on the other hand, I would say we would characterize them by consistent patterns and consistent patterns of harmful behavior. So we're talking about, they damage students emotionally, spiritually, relationally, sometimes even physically. The person in the dodgeball game who just goes a little too hard. You go, hey, that, and it's every time, right? Like, we got to calm that down. They create division
My bad.
among the volunteer team, right? And they just go like, no, we can't have that. Or they undermine you as the primary leader or the vision. Like, here's what we're doing. Here's the ministry vision. And they're just undermining that. They want to chip away at some of those things. I would say they resist the correction. Like you talked about, people who are just in a difficult season, they're often still teachable, but toxic leaders are not. They refuse, they resist correction. Yeah. They don't want to change. Everything is fine. And I would say this is a big one. This is one that, and oftentimes I would say most of it on that list is not something you can identify necessarily in an interview or, right? This is stuff you see once they're kind of really part of the team.
Yep.
And this one, they operate from unhealthy motives, which again, we got to be very careful because we can never judge someone's motives. But we start to see those patterns of like it's control, it's ego, it's a personal agenda. And since this is our world, maybe they're just the helicopter parent, or sometimes they're called a snowplow parent. And that's their motivation for being part of their team. And we go, that's not the best or the healthiest motivations.
Yeah, and definitely. And like you said, the key word here is what? Consistent, right? This is how they are consistently, right? We're not talking about, like I mentioned earlier, one bad day, one poor decision. We're talking about what? We're talking about patterns of behavior that show up again and again over time, even after coaching, even after conversations, even after we've like laid out really clear boundaries. And so I want to give our listeners maybe like a question to be able to discern the difference. And that is this: when I provide feedback or correction to that volunteer, how are they responding, right?
That's a good question. Yeah.
And so, how would a struggling volunteer respond to that? Who's like sincere, but they're just struggling. They're going through it. Maybe they'd say something like
let's
this.
pause. Let's pause right there, because that question think about 24, 25-year-old James. Providing correction or feedback to a person who's been, let's be honest, sometimes as a younger youth worker, you might have volunteers who have been volunteering in that ministry longer than you've been alive.
Facts.
And and there are times that even in those moments, that if you try to provide feedback or correction and they respond negatively, something is there, right? And so there has to be that question. I think lives in all of the spaces. It's a great question to ask and to evaluate how they respond.
Yeah, that's so good. That's a huge point, right? And it is hard, but I would encourage our young leaders. It's really what Paul said to Timothy: be courageous, but be respectful, be kind, right? We're not going to wear our authority on our sleeve. In fact, the whole point of authority is to what? Is serving with humility. That's how Jesus served. So just kind of, that's the one thing I would encourage our young youth pastors, youth volunteers to remember is that, always serve with humility and grace, and respect. What would a struggling volunteer say to that question, right? Opposed to like you said, someone who's like, they're intentionally kind of trying to undermine or, the ministry, or just kind of do their own thing. I think someone who's genuine would say, thank you for telling me. I didn't realize that. And they'd actually ask for feedback. They'd invite it. Like, how can I do better? They're humble, they want to grow, and they're actually grateful for the feedback, right? Even if it stings a little. It's actually a sign of maturity, right? It's actually a sign of someone who actually really cares about what? Ministering, not wanting the ministry to be something for them. Like, they're not trying to get something from the ministry. They're actually givers. I think on the opposite side of that is a toxic volunteer, someone who's unhealthy at the time, would typically respond with what? Defensiveness. They're going to deflect, and they're going to be dismissive. Oh, that's not, like right away, just kind of, that's not me. That maybe they'll say something like, well, that's just your opinion. I'm sure, Todd, you've heard that before, right? Or this one, like, especially like you said, if it's the younger speaking to the older, well, I've been doing this for years and I've never had a problem before. You know what I mean? Or we hear this a lot, oh, you're just being too sensitive, right? Maybe you're just being too sensitive. And so instead of inviting feedback or even being gracious with it, sometimes the feedback feedback may not be fully true, right? But we can still be gracious in receiving it. They make excuses, they go to blame, and they definitely will refuse accountability. You know what I mean? In fact, we'll be a little scriptural here, if as I like to say.
Let's go.
Proverbs 12:1 says this: "Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but whoever hates correction is stupid." I mean, like that's I don't remember what translation that is, but but that's definitely that the Hebrew word is translated stupid, I believe. So, but that's used there. But that's pretty blunt, right? But it captures something, Todd, I think really important, and that's teachability is a core character trait for healthy volunteers in our youth ministry. And someone who just consistently rejects correction, I think, is revealing something deeper about kind of where they're at, right?
Yeah. Something's not right. Something in your heart is not right. And I would say this: I'm just going to say it this way. Most of the time, I need to be reminded of that. Most of the time, it's easy for me to see what's wrong and feel the feels, like they're not respecting me or they're not whatever, they're just kind of a pain. I need to be reminded constantly something deeper is probably going on. And so how can I approach this that way? How can I pray for that person? And listen, we didn't intentionally skip over prayer. We just want to say this whole process, the identifying and working with leaders, is just bathed in prayer. If you're not praying for your leaders and how you can respond to them, then I would really encourage you to begin that process. But we're talking about like toxic leaders, and obviously when these things start popping up, we need to be checking them, praying about it, and invite other people in there. Are you seeing like leadership, right? Are you seeing this? And because we don't want the thing that's kind of negative in their heart to be in our heart. We want to, but we're gonna let's move forward. Let's talk about 7 types of volunteers, and here's kind of, James, I'm going to be honest. Here's my fear, is that as we do this, there's going to be people that pop in my head, right? I'm going to see faces, and I'm just making a commitment to you and to our listeners that as that happens, I'm gonna pray. I'm just gonna pray silently for them, because my guess is that's going to happen to everybody who's listening. Is they're going to go, "Oh, that's not so," right? And so let's just
not me. I mean, my leaders are listening. I think I make them listen. Leaders, none of you are any of these. I'm just telling you.
That's right. I love all of your leaders.
I do have great leaders. I'm actually not. I'm really not lying. In the past, I've had this.
I'm not a fan.
In the past,
Bob Huggins, who's your volunteer.
No, not right.
Sorry, that's a joke, guys. Okay, let's look at those 7 types.
Yeah, give me that first one, Todd.
The first one is the underminer. The underminer is that
sounds
volunteer.
Like a wrestling guy. Sounds like a guy in the WWE. The underminer. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, James, I feel like that could be true of all of these. So none of these are professional wrestlers. We're gonna kind of start with there.
Qualify that.
So the underminer, I would say, is that volunteer who is the one who's constantly questioning your leadership, your decisions, and oftentimes they don't do it in private, right, or in a constructive way.
Yeah, it's good.
They're doing it publicly. They might do it in front of students, and what's happening is they're eroding your confidence and your leadership, sometimes in yourself, but other people, they'll begin to erode that confidence as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And you might hear them say things like, "Well, I don't know why we're doing it this way." And the worst is when it's like they disagree with the way you're going to do it, and then they go, "See, I told you that wasn't going to work," right? So, I don't know why we're doing it this way. I told you it wasn't going to work. Sometimes if they've come from a different church, or you're maybe the newer youth leader, like the new primary leader, and they're going, "Well, my last church, we did it this way," or the last youth pastor did it a much better way. And, you're like, I don't know how that's helpful other than I heard you, and sometimes those underminers, they're the Monday morning quarterbacks, right? So they'll sit back. They won't really offer stuff up front, but afterwards they'll go, I think we could have done it this way, but hey, nobody asked me. And you go, okay, right? It's just like that breath in that moment. You just pray, it's a little silent prayer for that person. But and sometimes it's not even verbal. Sometimes it's their nonverbals. They roll their eyes when you're presenting an idea. That the sarcastic laugh that kind of undermines your authority as well. but they just kind of are there, kind of always second guessing the decisions. And from big things to small things like, oh, I would have taken this road and not that road. It just becomes like of such a tension for you,
Yeah,
and it
true.
breaks, that's not unifying at all. And so, and then what happens is oftentimes they kind of, people pick a side, right? They're on that
Yeah,
person's
yeah,
side.
yeah.
And so, yeah, so the underminer, it's not helpful, not effective, and oftentimes, really toxic, especially to the unity of the
Yeah.
group.
Yeah, and it's funny you're reading these, and I'm thinking, well, over my years, I've done some of that. I've been that guy myself as the leader. I think sometimes, I think some of our leaders are going to hear this, and and if we're honest, leaders, we might be this person. We've maybe been this person as a volunteer, right? And maybe we're like this even as a leader, right? And so I think this is going to help us in a lot of ways. If we're just really kind of honest, and we examine ourselves with some real kind of humility and vulnerability, just to kind of, let's just kind of, diagnose. You actually picked a sore spot for many, and that is directions. Like, how many arguments happen? Like, which way should we go to camp?
Yeah,
That's the,
yeah,
what I mean? Like that. Come on, leaders. You're laughing at that. That is dead on. You know what I mean? Like, which way should we go? Oh, well, I knew that. Well, that's fat. No, that's fat. I mean, yeah, all the things. So funny.
yep.
Yep.
And also that it sometimes it's change. And I
Yeah.
mean, I heard
Change.
somebody, I think it was at DYM this year, they said the only person, I think it was Doug, I think said the only person who loves change is a baby with a wet diaper. And so when you go to change something and somebody goes, I like the way we used to do it, and now they're going to kind of sabotage
Yeah.
the new change, and then go, see, I told you that wasn't going to work. So yeah, the underminer, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. I'm going to take, I'm also going to share another one, James, and then you're going to be up. But I'm going to talk about the gossip.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, the person who loves to be in the know, right? They seem to know everything. They got all the information on the students and the families and the other volunteers on the team, and it's not that they just have it, they love to spread it. And so, they often, and I feel like I haven't heard this in a sincere way in a long time, but I've definitely been in the places and in meetings where it was a prayer request, and when they're done sharing the prayer request, I go, that was not a prayer request at all. That was a God.
Insider information.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
overshared somebody else's
Facts.
situation. And so we have to be careful, right? Because I think I can say this freely. Most of us, if not all of us, love a little bit of gossip here and there.
Fall
And
nature.
so when somebody comes in and goes, did you hear about, my ears perk up? I want to know. I want to know what they know. And so we have to be, we have to be careful, especially if someone says, hey, I'm not one to gossip, but you go, oh, maybe we just stop the sentence right there, right?
Yeah.
I'm not one to gossip, and let's be done there. And then sometimes it even is in a, hey, can I tell you something in confidence, but don't tell anybody else.
Yeah.
And it's not their story. It's not their thing. It's about, someone else. And if you allow that in a culture, that will just thrive, right? Drama will thrive. And you need to create an atmosphere that's the opposite of distrust and suspicion, right? Create an atmosphere of authenticity. I'm going to share one quick story. And I was at a newer church, new to us, and we were sitting at a table, and somebody started to do one of those things that we just did. And it was like that Sunday morning before the service started, coffee and donuts, sitting at a table talking. And as that person started to share, someone interrupted them and said, I don't know where you're going with this, but to me it sounds like gossip. And I thought, holy cow, I've never. And that person stopped, and they looked at them, and they said, you know what, you're right, and stopped talking. And I thought,
Love
that's
that.
a culture I want to be a part of. I
Yep.
want to be a part of that, and not
that
did
was
you
cool.
hear. I want to be
Yeah.
in a group of people that goes, hey, I don't know where this is going, but that person's not here, and this sounds like gossip. Maybe we should.
Super good.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you have Proverbs. I'm going to throw a little scripture your way, James. Proverbs 16:28.
Yeah, go ahead.
Says that a perverse person stirs up conflict, and a gossip separates close friends. So, like, gossip kills community. And so,
Yeah.
if you have that in your leadership team, it's going to be toxic.
Yeah, heads up. Absolutely. Todd shared those two. I'm going to share number 3. Remember, we got 7. These are, and like I said, next episode, we're going to be sharing how do you deal with each, right? The next one is the boundary crosser. So, this could be thought of as maybe it's one of the most dangerous categories, but it does require immediate attention a lot of times. The boundary crosser doesn't respect appropriate boundaries with students, right?
Right.
And so,
Right.
because this one could be, like, yeah, this could go off the rails real quick if we don't address this, right? So, for example, here's some kind of warning signs of a boundary crosser, emotionally, physically, right? All those things. Texting students late at night or excessively, like, hey, what are you getting from that relationship? Why you know what I mean? Why do you feel the need to do these things? Meeting one-on-one with students without accountability or transparency, you know what I mean? Used, a leader with a student in a car that, they're not already have been good friends, parents, sometimes that does happen, but there's been a history with families, you know what I mean? And they've done that before, all those things. Though, but like I said, if that doesn't exist, then yeah, that's just not a good idea. That's not really acceptable. Physical touch, that's inappropriate or excessive. I'm sure if you've been in youth ministry for any amount of time, you've had to talk to a youth leader about that. I know I have. It's not comfortable when you're talking about talking to another youth leader who's being physically inappropriate
Yeah.
with a student, because that insinuates all sorts of things. Even when that person sometimes might not be fully aware and there really is no bad intention, they're just really maybe just ignorant in this area. I know I've had to do that. You just see it hurts them. You know what I mean? And then other times they kind of do know what they're doing. And I have no problem in those situations. You know what I mean? At all. And then, of course, sharing overly personal information with students. They're not, they're just not mature. They're not your friends. I tell that to leaders all the time. You are not their friends, right? You're someone you're an adult who's coming alongside kids. You are not a kid yourself. Showing favoritism to certain students in ways that feel unhealthy. And then, of course, dismissing safety policies or guidelines, that we've set up to keep students and leaders safer. So sometimes, really, Todd, the boundary crosser genuinely doesn't understand what's appropriate. I hit on that earlier. They're young, they're immature themselves. They might see students as peers rather than people they're shepherding. And that comes with time and maturity. We get that. We've all been there. I've been there, trying to be the buddy. And so, but really it's just a lack of understanding it doesn't make it any less dangerous, especially for the ministry as a whole too. Other times, the boundary crosser knows exactly what they're doing. They're grooming, they're manipulating, and they're predatory. Those are just creepy. Those you kind of get the weird feeling, when you see it, it looks away, it feels away, and you're like, and so we're going to step in right away. But either way, this type of behavior requires action, especially when it comes, obviously, to student safety. There's just zero tolerance, period. The next one, number 4, Todd, is the separator. And so the separator, right, we can call it the divider, but, the separator just sounds cooler. And so, we're just going with that one, the separator. But definitely WWE name. But the separator creates camps and cliques. And so, they have their kids and they make it known. They fuel competition rather than collaborating, being team players. They pit volunteers against each other. In fact, here's what you'll usually notice about the separator. The separator will refer to students as my kids. And I love that. Like I will tell my leaders, hey, listen, if you don't ever refer to your kids as my kids, there's something wrong, right? You need to, but it's possessive, right? These are mine. Like no other leader can have influence in their life. No, we actually teach just the opposite. So again, that's a whole nother teaching which we've mentioned before. Here's another characteristic. They compete with other volunteers for students' attention and affection. Maybe they're kind of sliding into to another leader's group. And so it's like, you know what I mean? Like, okay, but they're doing it for again, it's for selfish reasons. They want to be the one who's most liked. It's about them. It's not about sharing discipleship responsibility, which is what we teach. They speak negatively about other leaders to students. And think about how damaging that is. And then of course they celebrate when students prefer them over other leaders. So that's really what gets them going. That's what fuels them, which again, super unhealthy. So what's kind of fueling that for the separator? Every time I say the separator, by the way, Todd, I'm like, the separator. You know what I mean? That's what I hear in my head. But anyway,
I know that's what you're hearing.
That's exactly what I'm hearing in my head. But anyway, but here's where that comes from. They're insecure, and we all get it. Listen, Todd, am I wrong? We'd be lying if we hadn't had to wrestle with all that. We've all wrestled with that. The reality is, are you acting on that though? We all have those. We want to be liked. We want the kids to, see, but again, none of that is healthy, and we know that. So, the need to feel special, the need to be needed, the need to be important. And so really they create an us versus them mentality. And there's just really no place for that, in youth ministry. And it's, it just divides. So Todd, tell us the next one. What's number 5?
So number 5 is the unteachable, which, I mean, quite honestly, like so many of these things, you can have a conversation, you can coach them up, you can explain saying my kids is not good, spreading gossip is not good, right? You can have those conversations, but the unteachable leader refuses to grow or change. They just kind of decided they know better. They're not really interested in what you're doing as the ministry leader, your values or vision or core values. That's cute to them. They're here for their own agenda, and they're the ones that often will skip those mandatory training sessions or
Yeah.
your
Yeah. I don't
monthly
need that.
meetings. I don't need
Yeah.
that.
Yep.
They ignore the like if you have small group questions or like curriculum and you're like, hey, this is what we're doing, they just kind of toss that away and they teach their own agenda. In fact, I had a leader who was my son's small group leader. So you go, just think about it for a minute, would just take the questions and crumple them up and throw them away at the beginning of small group time.
Oof.
Like, why? They disregard the policies that we've had,
Yeah.
which go back to that, like, hey, now you're creating unsafe environments because we have
Yeah.
policies to keep you as leaders safe and students safe, and you're just gonna not, you're not gonna follow those. And then they often will respond with something like, hey, that's just not who I am, or I can't change, like this is who I'm, not my personality. And they're the ones who operate as like these kind of rogue agents within the ministry. They're just doing their own thing and they don't really worry about who they have to ask or who they're upsetting. And so that person really kind of needs to understand that being a volunteer means that they are submitting to your leadership and aligning with your vision. Now, again, literally right before we got on here, I had to talk to James, who's my good friend, about a situation that I'm facing where it's like, I don't like having to pull rank. I've never really been good at that. And I've always just, the leaders who have made me have to say that thing or pull rank. But sometimes you need to say, whether it's day 1 or year 10, hey, I am the leader, right? And so this is what we're doing. And so sometimes you kind of have to pull rank in order to lead and to teach the team.
Yeah. So good, Todd. Yeah. I'm going to do number 6. And number 6 is the complainer. And so, and I think we all can fall under this category
Yeah,
at
yeah,
times and
for
seasons or
sure.
moments. But for some, it's their MO, right? It's their modus operandi. And so, did I say that right, Todd? Modus operandi?
I think
Is
you
that
said it
right?
right there.
There you go. I thought so. There you go. I should have stopped while I was ahead. So anyway, but this is all right for them. For the complainer, everything's a problem. The schedule doesn't work for them. The curriculum is too hard or too easy. The room's too hot. Students are disrespectful, and all the other volunteers aren't doing enough. Right. So kind of all the things. Really, the complainer, what happens is a lot of times, Todd, I feel like they don't provide energy for the team. They actually they pull the energy away, right?
Drain
They
it.
pull the
Drain
energy.
it.
Yeah, they're drained. And so, really after spending time with the complainer, if really that's kind of how they're operating, you feel exhausted and discouraged all at the same time. And so, what makes this is toxic is really that it's kind of relentless. It's the little foxes that spoil the vine, and that's kind of how this one operates. It's just kind of the at first, the complainer, it seems harmless, but just as it builds, it kind of like, yeah, it brings some weight to it. And yeah, like I said, we're all human. We're going to complain, but really for the complainer, it's their default mode, and nothing is ever good enough, and nothing really ever satisfies them. So yeah, I think we all kind of have an idea of someone like that, or like I said, it could be us, and we need to ask God to deal with that for sure.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, the last one is the controller. And the controller is just that person. They need to be in charge. They wish they were in charge. When you give them a little bit of responsibility, man, they grab a hold of that with both hands, because it's difficult for them to serve under someone else's leadership. And so they sometimes will manipulate situations, pressure you to make a decision. Sometimes they even threaten or give you ultimatums to get their own way. So these leaders might just go ahead and go rogue and make decisions without consulting you. They might rally other volunteers to their side when they kind of sense there's a this or that as part of the conversation. They often will use their influence, their connections. I'm going to be really careful when I say this, but sometimes we are blessed with volunteers who are affluent, and they're such a blessing and very generous. And then if it doesn't go the way they want it to go, they'll leverage those resources. And so that can be, again, it goes from a blessing to a curse very quickly. Yep. But again, they just kind of, they just say, like, if you don't do it my way, right? That's just kind of part of their vernacular. Like, it's very self-motivating, selfish, and they just feel like they kind of really need to be the one that's calling the shots. They want the authority without the accountability. And they're particularly, a challenge. Longtime member of the church, right? They have significant influence. As we talked a little bit, they're a major donor to the church. And those influences, don't always equal, well, actually, they never should equal authority in ministry, right? Just because someone has those things, they shouldn't get a louder voice. So yeah, the controller can be a difficult one as well.
So in all of these, we went through those 7. Like I said, as we went through them, I'm not gonna lie, I saw myself in a lot of those through the years. You know what I mean? I had seasons of like, oh, dang, that was me. Yeah, I did that. You know what I mean? So, I definitely saw Todd in almost all of them.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it. I'll do that in confidence, but whatever.
There you go. That's it. Oh, we're recording. Anyway, no. But so Todd, let's move to, why then early identification matters, right? And that'll move us into really episode 2 as we keep going. But here.
Yeah.
So why does it matter? Why recognizing these patterns early? Why is that a big deal? And really, it's because, this stuff spreads. Toxic behavior, it always spreads. It's like a disease. And if you don't address it quickly, it grows. And so really, we know this, one toxic, I think we all have stories of one toxic volunteer, kind of affecting the entire team. They recruit allies, they create cultures of negativity, gossip, and of course, as we've seen and experienced, sadly, division. And like I said, sometimes we've been that person in a way, right? I know, like I said, and so but by identifying them early, it matters.
Yeah, I think the second reason it matters is because kids are watching. Our students are watching how we treat each other, and and if they see conversations and you got leaders rolling their eyes or being sarcastic, they're not only going to see that unhealthy behavior, they're going to begin to model it. And, where you're hoping that students would respect you and adult team, that will be severely damaged, and the students will begin to lack the respect for the adults in the room.
Yeah. And here's number 3. And I think we all know this, and that's healthy people don't stick around toxic environments. And so we don't want our best volunteers to what? To leave. We want them to stay, right? Because healthy people lead to what? Healthy ministries. It's why we do what we do. It's why we do all the things for our leaders, so that we create a healthy culture, a spiritually healthy culture. And so if we allow toxicity to persist, we really will lose those volunteers our ministries most need to keep.
Yeah, and let me hit you with one last one. And this one hits hard, but it's you're accountable to God for the health of the ministry. In fact, Acts 20:28, it says, "Keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers." And so you're not just managing programs. We are more than dodgeball and pizza. You're shepherding people and that adult team. And so there are wolves, and sometimes wolves get in, to the group. And so we have to be very careful. That phrase, wolves in sheep's clothing, and it's kind of like wolves in volunteer clothing. Just because they have the t-shirt on doesn't necessarily mean they're part of the team. And so, and I would just say this, I've learned the hard way that every time that I ignored the red flag or the toxic behavior, and I didn't address it, it got worse. And then every time that I did, and James, me, I'm not this. They love the next conflict. They can't wait for the next, or confrontation, maybe is the better word. That's not me, right? Like I would try to pray it away first, because I don't want to have that. I just want us to all get along, and I know that's unrealistic, but I know every time that I did that, I would go, man, I wish I did that sooner. So that early identification, it gives you options. You can provide training, right? You can set those clear expectations. You can coach. You can offer a different role that's a better fit, or maybe even a better ministry. That's they might be better in this ministry over here than, in student ministry. But if you wait until the damage is done, then you're going to be out of options. And now you're left with crisis management instead of protective leadership.
Yeah. And, here's what I know, Todd. I mean, I know for our listeners, like, this has been a little bit of a heavy topic. I think it's been fun too. I think, it's to identify these things. Yeah, it feels uncomfortable, but I know, like, we've all, as we mentioned, we're thinking about someone. Like I said, maybe we're thinking about ourselves. Maybe it's just a full bag of both, and of course, and we're wondering, what do we do next? And so here's what I want you to hear. Naming the problem is always the first step toward health. And so, we can't address what we won't acknowledge. So Todd, tell them kind of what's coming up in part 2 of this series.
Yeah, so part 2, I would say I'm way more excited about that because it is the how, right? How do we have those difficult conversations? How do we set boundaries? And then when it's time, how do we remove someone from the team? And so we're going to talk about, the politics of it, the pastoral care of it, the practical steps of all. And I just want to encourage you that if you're recognizing some of these patterns in some of your leaders, you're not imagining it, right? I would say trust your discernment, pray for wisdom. I would say, it might be time to have a conversation with direct report or senior pastor. Now, again, church politics, might have to be a little bit wise there. But maybe start documenting some of the things you're observing.
Yeah, super good.
And then that documentation will help you when the time comes to move forward.
Yeah. Well, I can't believe, Todd, we're done. Like I said, I was excited to do this episode and excited for the next one. I really think this episode is going to be really helpful to those who are listening. In fact, I know it is. I always want to thank all of you for listening to the Youth Ministry Soul Keeper podcast. It truly is a podcast that's dear to my heart, and I know Todd's heart. We love youth workers. We know what you guys go through. You're in the trenches, and we just appreciate you, and we want to encourage you any way we can. And, looking forward to you joining us for part 2. And, we'll tackle the tough part, like Todd said, addressing the toxic volunteer behavior. But until then, keep loving students, leading well, and protecting the ministry God has entrusted to you.